Welcome everybody to tonight's online program. My name is Carrie Ryan and I am the M+ Curator of Learning and Interpretation. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our final installment of How Did You Two Meet this evening. This program was initially conceived by the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal as part of a recipe book of public programs called How to Disturb the Public. Over the past few months, we have used the How Did You Two Meet recipe to introduce audiences to our different collecting areas. And the recipe goes like this. You choose the newest object in the collection, and then you choose the oldest object in the collection. Then you have a curator introduce the two objects and narrate a story that connects the two. Tonight, we are diving into the world of moving image. We will hear from curator Yolanda Blair, who will talk about one of the oldest works in the moving image collection, and associate curator Chanel Kong will talk about one of the newest works. Both of these works will be on view when we open to the public next year. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping points. Please enter your questions in the chat window. There's a little question mark box whenever you think of something, and at the end, I'll be moderating the Q&A session that will last about 10 minutes. The full program is scheduled to run about 30 minutes, so have about 20 minutes for the speaking part between Yolanda and Chanel. And if you'd like to use closed captioning, please click the closed captioning icon on the right of your screen. So now I'm really happy to introduce you to Yolanda, our first speaker.
So yes, as Kerry said, I'm Yolanda Blair. I'm the curator of moving image here at M+, and it's my pleasure to be here speaking at our final How Did You Two Meet event. Before I begin my presentation, I thought I should give a brief overview of moving image at M+, which is one of the three disciplinary areas that the museum focuses on alongside design and architecture and visual art. We've been building our collections since 2012, and the collection mostly spans the 1950s to the present. It's an international collection, though we do have a very strong Asian focus. And at M+, we try to connect different artistic tendencies across diverse geographies and cultural contexts, which is essentially what we're attempting to do this evening. The bulk of the M+ moving image collection encompasses artists' moving image, and this includes mostly video art and video installation. However, we also collect animation, digital art, documentary, experimental film, and even cinema-related archives. Many of the works in the moving image collection cross different genres and different mediums, and they're equally at home in a gallery as they are in a cinema. So tonight I've been tasked with discussing the oldest work that will be on display in the M+ galleries when we open next year. And this will be a work titled Free Radicals by the New Zealand-born artist Len Mai. It was a work that was made in '58 and then re-edited in 1979, which was just a few months before he passed away at the age of 78. But before telling you anything about the work or even about the artist, I wanted to just screen an excerpt so you can better understand what it is I'm talking about. So here are the first 2 minutes of Free Radicals, a work that runs for a total of 4 minutes and 25 seconds. as a scratch film, Free Radicals is a landmark achievement in the global history of moving image. Remarkably, the black and white animation was made without the use of a camera, using a subtractive drawing technique. The artist scratched the surface of the film's emulsion using dental tools, nails, needles, wire brushes, fine-tooth saws, and even an arrowhead. And so when it's magnified and animated with a projector, these tiny miniature scratches are then transformed into these jaunty figures of motion that vibrate and dance against that inky black frame. And the vigour and the vitality of the film belies the many, many months that Len Lai spent painstakingly inscribing these tiny marks onto more than 7,000 frames of 16mm film, 1.65 centimetre wide film strip. And then in 1979, he decided to re-edit the film, cutting it from 5 minutes down to a little over 4 minutes, and therefore losing 1,500 of these hand-etched film frames in the process. With its jagged kind of lightning bolts, its fiery stars and atomic particles, Free Radicals harnesses the inherent motion of the natural world to stimulate a sensory experience in the audience, an experience that goes beyond sight. The work's title is a reference to modern physics. Free radicals are particles of energy, and Lai's film attempts to express the energy that connects human life and the human body with the natural world. That connection of his film with body movement is underscored by his choice of African tribal music. He was aiming for effective impact and what he called bodily empathy with his audience. He really wanted to capture motion to activate a sort of sensory, full-bodied viewing experience. It could be said that Len Lai himself was a free radical. He was an extraordinary polymath, an interdisciplinary maker, and a thinker who lived an extraordinarily rich life spanning multiple continents. And as such, his work presents a really intriguing example of regional modernism. He combined Maori, Aboriginal, Samoan, and modernist Western influences. He was born in Christchurch on the South Island of New Zealand, and he was raised for a time in a lighthouse. And his films and sculptures often evoke the tidal patterns, the cloud formations, and the vicious nighttime storms that he experienced. And I think you can see this in Free Radicals that we just watched. Lai spent his entire career pursuing this art of movement, and it was a theory that he developed in his graduate years. He was very young, a young artist, and he developed this theory while watching clouds sweep over the sort of windy hills of his native New Zealand. As I mentioned, he lived in Australia and Samoa in his early 20s, and his first-hand exposure to Indigenous arts and culture really profoundly affected his future art making. He moved to London in 1926, and then a decade later he exhibited alongside major figures like Marcel Duchamp, Jean Moreau, Man Ray in the International Surrealist Exhibition. And the surrealist practice of automatism and their spirit of spontaneity is evident in much of Lai's work. In 1944, he then moved to New York City, and it was here that he really established himself as a cinematic innovator and also one of the most respected artists in the burgeoning kinetic art movement. We have a couple more works of Len Lai's in the M+ collection. On the left, we have Colour Cry, which was the first major American film and Lai's first experiment with 16mm. And that was based on a development of Man Ray's rayogram or shadow cast photographic process. And he used stencils, he used fabrics, film strips with sprocket holes and coloured gels to create these dynamic silhouetted patterns. On the right is Particles in Space, which was the final film that Lai ever made, and that we saw him then return to that reduced black and white palette and the calligraphic material of Free Radicals, where clusters of small scratches give the film a kind of pebbled texture. Unfortunately, the critical success of Free Radicals did not translate financially, and Lai was unable to sustain his filmmaking career. And instead, he began channeling his artistic energy into sculpture, becoming a leading figure in the kinetic art movement of the 1960s and 1970s in New York. But yes, it was through sculpture that he did end up further developing this lifetime interest in this in the figures of motion. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to now pass over to my colleague Chanel Kong, who is our Associate Curator for Moving Image, and who will discuss a very, very different work and a much, much more recent work from the M+ Moving Image collection.
Thank you, Yolanda. So hello, my name is Chanel. I'm the Associate Curator of Moving Image here at M+. Like Yolanda, I work on exhibitions and building the M+ collection, but a lot of my work is around curating programs and events at our cinemas. So for this edition of How Did You Two Meet, I'm really happy to have an opportunity to talk about one of the newest moving image works in the M+ collection, and it's titled The Retrieval, Restoration, and Predicament, and it's made by a young local artist, Lee Kai-chung. So Lee Kai-chung's multimedia and research-based practice responds to the idea of the public archive and the social-political importance of record-keeping in Hong Kong. His project, the Open Archives Initiative, is a collective platform that collects historical records from the community and encourages the public awareness of the archives issue in Hong Kong. The research project has also led Lee to establish Archive of the People, which is a collective made in 2016 and commissioned by Parasite and subsequently exhibited at Art Basel, Hong Kong. So Lee Kai-chung's practice, I think he considers his performances, installations, and documentations as gestures of political and artistic transgression, which in part explains why his work has such strong resonance to us today. We're looking at Lee's work. Again, it's called The Retrieval, Restoration, and Predicament, and it's a work from 2018. The work is an installation composed of a single-channel video and 9 bronze sculptures that Lee cast during using a 3D modeling process. So on the left, you can see a photo showing how the work has been installed at a show in Sanya, China. And on the right, you can also recognize some of the bronze pieces as parts of the Queen Victoria statue that is now part of Victoria Park in Causeway Bay. So in this work, Lee traces the circulation of some of the bronze statues that were confiscated and captured by the Japanese army during the occupation of Hong Kong in the Second World War, and how these pieces were subsequently retrieved, restored, and reinstated back in Hong Kong. For today's discussion, I'll be focusing on the single channel video to talk about this work. So only 4 of the 11 bronze statues that were confiscated actually survived the war and are now back in Hong Kong. So these are the Queen Victoria statue, which I just mentioned is now in Causeway Bay, the 2 HSBC bronze lions in Central, and also quite close by to the lions is the statue of Sir Thomas Jackson, who's the founder of HSBC, now still found in Statue Square. So the life of these statues, from their damaged parts, their days in captivity, to their being retrieved overseas, restored, and also actually redisplaced yet again in Hong Kong, is suggested by stories told by 3 narrators. So we hear 3 voices in this video, a Japanese mason turned soldier, a Cantonese-speaking female narrator, which might be one of the lions in the HSBC Lions, and also a British member of the Hong Kong regiment who was a prisoner of war. So in 3 different languages, the lives of these bronze objects are given dimension and perspective, set in a context that speaks to the complexity of the transnational forces at play at the time. So the work actually is around 30 minutes, but right now I'd like to show a 2-minute excerpt featuring the female narrator and also the Queen Victoria statue.
返到香港之後，佢返唔到廣場。講真，抵佢死，手手腳腳冇一塊完整。工人將銅像再次放喺華蓋下。想移正位置， 有啲嘢好似卡住咗，無論點樣扭動、升高，都冇辦法令佢轉身。事情做得滴水不漏，就係難放，俾佢一個轉身嘅機會。同樣嘅情況喺10幾年之後重演，佢俾人塗寫咗啲字句，好似幅名畫染咗啲菜汁咁，睇到都嘔心。官員尷尬到不得了，派人再次將佢移走。原本戰時溶咗嘅部分，揾咗個意大利嘅藝術家去重新塑造修補，但係政府唔夠錢去修補。我老闆又唔願意無條件出錢，糾纏咗一輪，最後拍賣咗啲嘢，先籌到啲咁多嘅資金去復修。但係嗰次又將復修好嘅部件拆落嚟，將驕傲寄託喺死物上。你話人係咪愚昧虛妄得可愛？遠遠睇住佢哋嘅困態，以前佢就靚到你唔敢直望佢，而家就為難在生嘅人。啱啊，佢天生就係為人製造麻煩。
You can see from this excerpt that Li Kai-chung is providing these untold stories around the history of these objects. He interjects the telling of these stories with archival footage, as well as modern-day footage that he shot himself of the objects and places mentioned in these stories. It's as though these objects are now given a voice, perhaps multiple voices, of others who's played a role in the life of these objects. The interlacing and layering of these techniques, voices, and materials come together in a work that is at once speculative, but also based on historical documentation and research. Li's interest in the place of the archive is revealed forcefully in the story of monuments and their place in society. If you're interested in learning further, I would encourage everyone to discover this work in full when our museum opens, when this work will be available at our Mediatek. So our Mediatek is a space where you can view more than 200 of our moving image collection on demand, and it's another way for everyone to discover our moving image collection.
Thank you, Chanel and Yolanda. I have to say that just on the surface, when we found out what these two works would be, I actually have no idea what would connect them. And even just hearing you guys talk, I'm like, oh, where are they going to connect them? I have a couple of thoughts, but I want to see what you guys say. So I'll turn it over to you guys.
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of interesting that these two works are paired, you know, here and now, thinking about what is the place of art these days, but also what is the place of the museum in terms of why we collect what we collect. I guess at the first instance, I think there's something that's quite beautiful that connects the two, is that the way Li Kai-chung is constructing his stories, but also part of his practice is to reveal the different facets to a story. So whether that means he has to collect footage while traveling in the region, or collecting stories from different types of players that kind of play into the story of history making. I think it has something to do with how this region has always been a place where, you know, travel and transnational issues are part of the kind of the fabric of everyone's creative practice.
And I suppose that is, personified in the figure of Li, who was such an itinerant artist and who, like a bowerbird, was collecting inspiration from so many different cultures and contexts. You know, in Samoa, he was really inspired by tattooing and by tapa cloths. He, you know, went out of his way to research Aboriginal art practices in Australia. He, as I mentioned, was working very closely with artists like Man Ray and Duchamp in London, and then, you know, was also interfacing with many of the abstract expressionists in New York. His visual vocabulary, his visual language is such a kind of a motley mix of so many different cultural expressions, and is a transnational figure personified.
Yeah, I guess these two works also speaks to sort of the breadth, but also the range of works we look at as part of the moving image team. We can see actually both of them are thinking kind of outside of the medium or the technique when they're thinking about their practice. And it's interesting how we're also kind of, it's a constant evolution of what we think of as a moving image work or a moving image practice. I think it's an interesting part of my job.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've spoken previously about how both of these artists are moving image artists, absolutely, but they're also looking and working beyond the camera. Lai didn't use a camera to make his work, whereas Lee Kai-chung was, of course, making the film, but the sculptures are such an important, the installation is such an important, physical practice as well. Yeah.
So maybe I'll just start it off. And one of the questions I had was, certainly as you were starting to talk, I suddenly realized, oh, it is really about this expanded idea of what moving image is, and sort of taking it away from the camera and then adding in the sculptural elements, but also then using the material and kind of stepping away from what we might typically think of as a film. So I think on top that automatically kind of that was a real surprise to me to kind of think, oh yes, this is really about the expanded notion of moving image. But then what I was really thinking about was actually how visitors might encounter these works and how they might relate to them sort of as they're visiting the museum. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how you might see the local audience relating to these works here and now in Hong Kong.
Okay, I guess I'll start by saying that I think Lai was so interested in having this kind of physical impact on the viewer that his work seems to have a kind of universal quality or a timelessness, that he wants to kind of connect the viewer's senses with this idea of motion, that it doesn't matter, what your sort of cultural background is. It doesn't matter what sort of prior knowledge you may or may not have with his work or with any artwork. Really, it's about having this very direct, visceral impact. So I would say that Lai's work created 60 years ago. I think has just a powerful impact today, as it did, at the time of its making, I imagine.
I think Lee Kai-chung's work, made in such a recent time, we're also sort of contending with these notions of monuments, their place in society, record keeping. These are all issues that we are thinking about every day as members of society, but also as artists. I think that is already something that drives a lot of Lee Kai-chung's practice, but also the interest in where his work might develop into. I think that's really interesting in terms of the local audience. But in general, I think Lee Kai-chung's interest in archives is really interesting as a parallel to sort of our digital existence these days, with how we operate ourselves and keep our own records with our phones or social media accounts, how we document our own lives. What is the place of our own archive in terms of the telling of our own stories? And you think about how that translated to an identity of a city or a place. It's quite interesting, and I thought it was really kind of telling what Lee Kai-chung is saying about monuments versus record keeping. What do we get to keep, or who deserves to be kept as a record, or who deserves to be memorialized? I think that those are things that I think everyone who has a phone and who has a social media account also can say something about. So there's an interesting parallel there.
So there's a few questions that have come in, and I'm gonna try and ask as many as we can in the next few minutes. But just sort of as a follow-up, Chanel, and there's another question I'm going to add on top of this for both of you. But the first question is how important are the retrievals physical objects to understanding the piece as a whole? And can we view the video aspect of the work as a standalone artwork? And then kind of coming from that is what actually constitutes a moving image. So something like this is in the moving image collection. So maybe kind of talk about the those pieces, and then maybe both of you can talk a little bit about what constitutes a moving image.
Yeah, so about the bronze pieces, so Li Kai-chung did a 3D modeling process to recast parts of the Queen Victoria statue in bronze, and that is kind of telling the parts of the statue that were either damaged and restored, or where the damaged parts were actually replaced later on by another, I guess, stand-in. So, for example, parts of the parts of the lion and the unicorn, some of them were replaced by other symbols, actually. And the funding and the planning for the restoration of these particular parts is sort of the evidence for how monuments also change and have their own morphology. So in a way, the bronze statues work very well with the single channel work and telling the stories and having the materiality of the archival aspect of it be brought to light. So I thought that might be part of how we can understand the two parts of his work. But I think as it stands on its own, the single channel video also tells a very kind of interesting layered story. Definitely worth rewatching a few times, because you can kind of tell some other stories that are actually elicited. There's stories about a 10-cent nickel coin that the prisoner of war kept in his pocket. There's all of these micro histories that really resonate with, the life of objects, but also really everything that underlies the history of the city. So there's so many stories there to be told. So I think they're both, they really work well together, but also as on its own.
And I guess, yeah, as I said at the beginning, at M+, we have a very expansive view of what moving image is. And I think, some quarters, maybe Lies Kinetic Sculpture could be considered moving image. At M+, we are looking at mostly lens-based practices, or works that can be projected or screened. And yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning, for us, moving image encompasses things like film, like new media, animation, else am I forgetting? Experimental film, documentary. Yeah, it's a very broad, big umbrella. It's a term, moving image, it's a relatively recent term, and I think it's come about due to developments in technology as film and filmmaking has shifted from being primarily about celluloid as we've moved into the digital realm. Yeah, the practice of filmmaking has been sort of severed from a particular format. It's important that we kind of be a little bit more inclusive, I guess, of many different sorts of practices. Hence that term, moving image.
I think we also, care very much about how these works are conserved, but also how they're exhibited. In the galleries, we try to, of course, display the work as it's intended, but because of all of the different spaces in our museum, we also try to explore the different ways that we can offer audiences different opportunities to explore the work. So, some works might be seen in the cinemas, sometimes in the Mediatek, sometimes in the galleries. So I think there is that kind of constant notion of what is moving image, and this is kind of part of the interesting part of what we do.
Yeah, I guess I could also add that Free Radicals we've acquired both as a film print, both a celluloid print, as well as a digitised version. So when we open in the next year in the galleries, we will be showing Free Radicals as the digital version in the galleries, but there will also be opportunities in the future for us to project it as a film print in the cinemas. The work was restored in the early 2000s. Len Lai, before he died, set up the Len Lai Foundation, which the foundation, with the support also of the New Zealand Film Commission, was able to restore the film. And so, yeah, we've got a beautiful print to be premiered to audiences in Hong Kong in the not too distant future.
I have a couple more questions that I'm going to try and sneak in. One of the questions that I wanted to ask, which is a little follow-up to either of you really, which is what are MPLUS's plans for film restoration? So you sort of touched on a little bit of that, but is there anything more you can share?
We have, sort of plans, but nothing confirmed. So I think we would like to potentially, start restoring some local-made films. But it's not yet confirmed. We have acquired films that have already been restored, such as Free Radicals. But in terms of our own sort of work, it will require some fundraising, and logistically it's a very, very big undertaking and a very important undertaking. I mean, there are other organisations in Hong Kong that are also doing this work. So it's just something we're working through.
Yeah, sounds good. So maybe this will be my last question. And Chanel, I think you will be able to answer this one, which is what our future cinema program strategy is. And a couple of people have asked about the difference between an art house film and a moving image artwork. And so maybe you can talk about that too in that question.
Sure. So we have 3 houses in our cinemas in M+. So we hope to be building a lot of community relationships, working with a lot of organizations to present programs. But for our own internal program, we have the ambition of providing a different voice, a different way of looking at cinema in all its forms, but also moving image practice in its different formats and approaches. So we will have releases of new art house cinema films. For example, some festival titles from the last few years. We'll also have curated programs for those of you who have followed M+ screenings in the last few years. We'll also have curated thematic programs like that. We'll also have things like strands, like series of different types of films that you can find throughout the year at our cinemas that will be offering everything from things for younger viewers to people who are more primed for more challenging works. We want to have just a space that is really looking at a broad spectrum of current and also, past practices in moving image. And I think, as Yolanda said, I think moving image works versus film. I think there is a lot of semantic kind of discussions going on what constitutes each, but I think in general we're looking at both things that are commercially released, but also things that are moving and circulating through other channels, such as galleries, such as independent, cooperatives and groups, and a lot of different types of organizations that are producing and advocating for different forms of image making. So we're looking into many different types of content. And so the notion between a film and a moving image might stem from this difference of how it's been circulated, how the business or commercial side of it has underpinned its definition, but we also just want to be able to open that up a little bit and offer kind of broader views on kind of all of it and how they all relate. I think that's the interesting part.
One last quick question. Do you have plans to screen any films online so cinema lovers around the world can see what we have in the collection?
Yeah, so funny you asked that. So we're planning to have a small experiment of a version of M+ screenings that will be online, coming up in the next few months, where we'll be trying to really address this new reality of a very, very entrenched kind of online life that we have in terms of watching content, and the term content is a huge debate that we have as well, but also this idea of collective viewing. What does it mean when we have hybrid versions of our lives, sometimes, having online meetings or online screenings versus, in cinemas viewings or in-person meetings, for example. So I think we'll be kind of trying to play around this notion in our upcoming experiments. So please stay tuned.
And I guess that's a great way to end tonight's program. And it was such a pleasure hearing from both of you tonight, Chanel and Yolanda. So thank you, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.